This is a Willow audiobook. Ozma of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Read by Stephen Alexander. Chapter 9. The Royal Family of Ev. The Tin Woodman was the first to address the meeting. "To begin with," said he, "word came to our noble and illustrious ruler, Ozma of Oz, that the wife and 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls, of the former King of Ev, by name Evoldo, have been enslaved by the Gnome King, and are held prisoners in his underground palace. Also that there was no one in Ev powerful enough to release them. Naturally, our Ozma wished to undertake the adventure of liberating the poor prisoners, but for a long time she could find no way to cross the great desert between the two countries. Finally, she went to a friendly sorceress of our land named Glinda the Good, who heard the story and at once presented Ozma a magic carpet, which would continually unroll beneath our feet and so make a comfortable path for us to cross the desert. As soon as she had received the carpet, our gracious ruler ordered me to assemble our army, which I did. You behold in these warriors the pick of all the finest soldiers of Oz, and, if we are obliged to fight the Gnome King, every officer, as well as the private, will battle fiercely unto death." Then Tick-Tock spoke.
"Why should you fight the Gnome King?"
he asked.
"He has done no wrong."
"No wrong?" cried Dorothy. "Isn't it wrong to imprison a queen mother and her 10 children?
"They were sold to the Gnome King by King Evoldo,"
replied Tick-Tock.
"It was the King of Ev who did wrong, and when he realized what he had done, he jumped into the sea and drowned himself."
"This is news to me," said Ozma thoughtfully. "I had supposed the Gnome King was all to blame in the matter. But in any case, he must be made to liberate the prisoners." "My Uncle Evoldo was a very wicked man," declared the Princess Langwidere. "If he had drowned himself before he sold his family, no one would have cared. But he sold them to the powerful Gnome King in exchange for a long life, and afterward destroyed the life by jumping into the sea." "Then," said Ozma, "he did not get the long life, and the Gnome King must give up the prisoners. Where are they confined?" "No one knows exactly," replied the princess, "for the king, whose name is Roquat of the Rocks, owns a splendid palace underneath the great mountain which is at the north end of this kingdom, and he has transformed the queen and her children into ornaments and bric-a-brac with which to decorate his rooms." "I'd like to know," said Dorothy, "who this Gnome King is." "I will tell you," replied Ozma. "He is said to be the ruler of the underground world, and commands the rocks and all that the rocks contain. Under his rule are many thousands of the gnomes, who are queerly shaped but powerful sprites, that labour at the furnaces and forges of their king, making gold and silver and other metals which they conceal in the crevices of the rocks, so that those living upon the earth's surface can only find them with great difficulty. Also they make diamonds and rubies and emeralds, which they hide in the ground, so that the kingdom of the gnomes is wonderfully rich, and all we have of precious stones and silver and gold is what we take from the earth and rocks where the Gnome King has hidden them." "I understand," said Dorothy, nodding her little head wisely. "For the reason that we often steal his treasures," continued Ozma, "the ruler of the underground world is not fond of those who live upon the earth's surface and never appears among us. If we wish to see King Roquat of the Rocks, we must visit his own country, where he is all-powerful, and therefore it will be a dangerous undertaking." "But for the sake of the poor prisoners," said Dorothy, "we ought to do it."
"We shall do it," replied the Scarecrow, "although it requires a lot of courage for me to go near to the furnaces of the Gnome King, for I am only stuffed with straw, and a single spark of fire might destroy me entirely."
"The furnaces may also melt my tin," said the Tin Woodman, "but I am going." "I can't bear heat," remarked the Princess Langwidere, yawning lazily, "so I shall stay at home. But I wish you may have success in your undertaking, for I am heartily tired of ruling this stupid kingdom, and I need more leisure in which to admire my beautiful heads." "We do not need you," said Ozma, "for if with the aid of my brave followers I cannot accomplish my purpose, then it would be useless for you to undertake the journey." "Quite true," sighed the princess. "So, if you'll excuse me, I will now retire to my cabinet. I've worn this head quite a while, and I want to change it for another." When she had left them, and you may be sure no one was sorry to see her go, Ozma said to Tik-Tok, "Will you join our party?"
"I am the slave of the girl Dorothy, who rescued me from prison,"
replied the machine.
"Where she goes, I will go."
"Oh, I'm going with my friends, of course," said Dorothy quickly. "I wouldn't miss the fun for anything. Will you go too, Billina?" "To be sure," said Billina in a careless tone. She was smoothing down the feathers of her back and not paying much attention.
"Heat is just in her line," remarked the Scarecrow. "If she is nicely roasted, she'll be better than ever."
"Then," said Ozma, "we will arrange to start for the Kingdom of the Gnomes at daybreak tomorrow, and in the meantime we will rest and prepare ourselves for the journey." Although Princess Langwidere did not appear again to her guests, the palace servants waited upon the strangers from Oz and did everything in their power to make the party comfortable. There were many vacant rooms at their disposal, and the brave army of 27 was easily provided for and liberally feasted. The Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger were unharnessed from the chariot and allowed to roam at will throughout the palace, where they nearly frightened the servants into fits, although they did no harm at all. At one time, Dorothy found the little maid Nanda crouching in terror in a corner, with the Hungry Tiger standing before her.
"You certainly look delicious,"
the beast was saying.
"Will you kindly give me permission to eat you?"
"No, no, no!" cried the maid in reply.
"Then," said the tiger, yawning frightfully, "please to get me about 30 pounds of tenderloin steak, cooked rare, with a peck of boiled potatoes on the side, and 5 gallons of ice cream for dessert."
I'll do the best I can," said Nanda, and she ran away as fast as she could go. "Are you so very hungry?" asked Dorothy in wonder.
"You can hardly imagine the size of my appetite,"
replied the tiger sadly.
"It seems to fill my whole body, from the end of my throat to the tip of my tail. I am very sure the appetite doesn't fit me, and is too large for the size of my body. Some day, when I meet a dentist with a pair of forceps, I'm going to have it pulled."
"What, your tooth?" asked Dorothy.
"No, my appetite," said the Hungry Tiger.
The little girl spent most of the afternoon talking with the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman, who related to her all that had taken place in the Land of Oz since Dorothy had left it. She was very much interested in the story of Ozma, who had been, when a baby, stolen by a wicked old witch and transformed into a boy. She did not know that she had ever been a girl until she was restored to her natural form by a kind sorceress. Then it was found that she was the only child of the former ruler of Oz, and was entitled to rule in his place. Ozma had many adventures, however, before she regained her father's throne, and in these she was accompanied by a pumpkin-headed man, a highly magnified and thoroughly educated wogglebug, and a wonderful sawhorse that had been brought to life by means of a magic powder. The Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman had also assisted her, but the Cowardly Lion, who ruled the great forest as the king of beasts, knew nothing of Ozma until after she became the reigning Princess of Oz. Then he journeyed to the Emerald City to see her, and on hearing she was about to visit the land of Ev to set free the royal family of that country, the Cowardly Lion begged to go with her, and brought along his friend, the Hungry Tiger, as well. Having heard this story, Dorothy related to them her own adventures, and then went out with her friends to find the sawhorse, which Ozma had caused to be shod with plates of gold so that its legs would not wear out. They came upon the sawhorse standing motionless beside the garden gate. But when Dorothy was introduced to him, he bowed politely and blinked his eyes, which were knots of wood, and wagged his tail, which was only the branch of a tree.
"What a remarkable thing to be alive!"
exclaimed Dorothy.
"I quite agree with you,"
replied the sawhorse, in a rough but not unpleasant voice.
"A creature like me has no business to live, as we all know. But it was the magic powder that did it, so I cannot justly be blamed."
"Of course not," said Dorothy. "And you seem to be of some use, 'cause I noticed the Scarecrow riding upon your back."
"Oh yes, I'm of use,"
returned the sawhorse.
"and I never tire, never have to be fed or cared for in any way."
"Are you intelligent?" asked the girl.
"Not very," said the creature. "It would be foolish to waste intelligence on a common sawhorse when so many professors need it. But I know enough to obey my masters and to get up or woe when I'm told to. So I'm pretty well satisfied."
That night Dorothy slept in a pleasant little bedchamber next to that occupied by Ozma of Oz, and Billina perched upon the foot of the bed and tucked her head under her wing, and slept as soundly in that position as did Dorothy upon her soft cushions. But before daybreak everyone was awake and stirring, and soon the adventurers were eating a hasty breakfast in the great dining room of the palace. Ozma sat at the head of a long table on a raised platform, with Dorothy on her right hand and the Scarecrow on her left. The Scarecrow did not eat, of course, but Ozma placed him near her so that she might ask his advice about the journey while she ate. Lower down the table were the 27 warriors of Oz, and at the end of the room the lion and the tiger were eating out of a kettle that had been placed upon the floor, while Billina fluttered around to pick up any scraps that might be scattered. It did not take long to finish the meal, and then the lion and the tiger were harnessed to the chariot, and the party was ready to start for the Nome King's palace. First rode Ozma, with Dorothy beside her in the golden chariot and holding Billina fast in her arms. Then came the Scarecrow on the sawhorse, with the Tin Woodman and Tick-Tock marching side by side just behind him. After these tramped the army, looking brave and handsome in their splendid uniforms. The generals commanded the colonels, and the colonels commanded the majors, and the majors commanded the captains, and the captains commanded the private, who marched with an air of proud importance because it required so many officers to give him his orders. And so, the magnificent procession left the palace and started along the road just as day was breaking. And by the time the sun came out, they had made good progress toward the valley that led to the Nome King's domain. Chapter 10. The Giant with the Hammer. The road led for a time through a pretty farm country, and then past a picnic grove that was very inviting, but the procession continued to steadily advance, until Billina cried in an abrupt and commanding manner,
"Wait! Wait!"
Ozma stopped her chariot so suddenly that the Scarecrow's sawhorse nearly ran into it, and the ranks of the army tumbled over one another before they could come to a halt. Immediately the yellow hen struggled from Dorothy's arms and flew into a clump of bushes by the roadside.
"What's the matter?"
called the Tin Woodman anxiously.
"Why, Billina wants to lay her egg, that's all,"
said Dorothy.
"Lay her egg?"
repeated the Tin Woodman in astonishment.
"Yes.
She lays one every morning about this time, and it's quite fresh," said the girl. "But does your foolish old hen suppose that this entire cavalcade, which is bound on an important adventure, is going to stand still while she lays her egg?" inquired the Tin Woodman earnestly. "What else can we do?" asked the girl. "It's a habit of Bellina's, and she can't break herself of it." "Then she must hurry up," said the Tin Woodman impatiently.
No, no, exclaimed the Scarecrow. If she hurries, she may lay scrambled eggs.
"That's nonsense," said Dorothy. "The Bellina won't be long, I'm sure." So they stood and waited, although all were restless and anxious to proceed. And by, the yellow hen came from the bushes, saying,
"What is she doing? Singing her lay?"
asked the Scarecrow.
"Forward, march!"
shouted the Tin Woodman, waving his axe, and the procession started just as Dorothy had once more grabbed Bellina in her arms.
"Isn't anyone going to get my egg?"
cried the hen in great excitement.
"I'll get it,"
said the Scarecrow, and at his command the Sawhorse pranced into the bushes. The Straw Man soon found the egg, which he placed in his jacket pocket. The cavalcade, having moved rapidly on, was even then far in advance, but it did not take the Sawhorse long to catch up with it, and presently the Scarecrow was riding in his accustomed place behind Ozma's chariot.
"What shall I do with the egg?"
he asked Dorothy. "I do not know," the girl answered. "Perhaps the hungry tiger would like it."
"It would not be enough to fill one of my back teeth," remarked the tiger. "A bushel of them, hard-boiled, might take a little of the edge off my appetite, but one egg isn't good for anything at all, that I know of."
"No, it wouldn't even make a sponge cake,"
said the Scarecrow thoughtfully.
"The Tin Woodman might carry it with his axe and hatch it, but after all I may as well keep it myself for a souvenir."
So he left it in his pocket. They had now reached that part of the valley that lay between the two high mountains which Dorothy had seen from her tower window. At the far end was the third great mountain, which blocked the valley and was the northern edge of the land of Ev. It was underneath this mountain that the Gnome King's palace was said to be, but it would be some time before they reached that place. The path was becoming rocky and difficult for the wheels of the chariot to pass over, and presently a deep gulf appeared at their feet, which was too wide for them to leap. So Ozma took a small square of green cloth from her pocket and threw it upon the ground. At once it became the magic carpet and unrolled itself far enough for all the cavalcade to walk upon. The chariot now advanced, and the green carpet unrolled before it, crossing the gulf on a level with its banks, so that all passed over in safety.
"That's easy enough," said the Scarecrow. "I wonder what will happen next."
He was not long in making the discovery, for the sides of the mountain came closer together, until finally there was but a narrow path between them, along which Ozma and her party were forced to pass in single file. They now heard a low and deep thump. Thump. Thump, which echoed throughout the valley and seemed to grow louder as they advanced. Then, turning a corner of rock, they saw before them a huge form which towered above the path for more than 100 feet. The form was that of a gigantic man built out of plates of cast iron, and it stood with one foot on either side of the narrow road and swung over its right shoulder an immense iron mallet with which it constantly pounded the earth. These resounding blows explained the thumping sounds they had heard, for the mallet was much bigger than a barrel, and where it struck the path between the rocky sides of the mountain, it filled all the space through which our travellers would be obliged to pass. Of course, they at once halted, a safe distance away from the terrible iron mallet. The magic carpet would do them no good in this case, for it was only meant to protect them from dangers upon the ground beneath their feet, and not from dangers that appeared in the air above them.
"Wow," said the Cowardly Lion with a shudder. "It makes me dreadfully nervous to see that big hammer pounding so near my head. One blow would crush me into a doormat."
"The Iron Giant is a fine fellow,"
said Tick-Tock.
"and works as steadily as a clock. He was made for the Gnome King by Smith and Tinker, who made me, and his duty is to keep folks from finding the underground palace. Is he not a great work of art?"
"Can he think and speak as you do?" asked Ozma, regarding the giant with wondering eyes.
"No,"
replied the machine.
"he is only made to pound the road and has no thinking or speaking attachment. But he pounds very well, I think."
Too well,
observed the Scarecrow.
he is keeping us from going farther. Is there no way to stop his machinery?
"Only the Gnome King, who has the key, can do that,"
answered Tick-Tock. "Then," said Dorothy anxiously, "what shall we do?"
"Excuse me for a few minutes,"
said the Scarecrow,
"and I will think it over."
He retired then to a position in the rear, where he turned his painted face to the rocks and began to think. Meantime, the giant continued to raise his iron mallet high in the air and to strike the path terrific blows that echoed through the mountains like the roar of a cannon. Each time the mallet lifted, however, there was a moment when the path beneath the monster was free, and perhaps the Scarecrow had noticed this, for when he came back to the others, he said,
"The matter is a very simple one after all. We have but to run under the hammer, one at a time when it is lifted, and to pass to the other side before it falls again."
"It will require quick work if we escape the blow," said the Tin Woodman with a shake of his head. "But it really seems the only thing to be done. Who will make the first attempt?" They looked at one another hesitatingly for a moment. Then the Cowardly Lion, who was trembling like a leaf in the wind, said to them,
"I suppose the head of the procession must go first, and that's me. But I'm terribly afraid of the big hammer."
"What will become of me?" asked Ozma. "You might rush under the hammer yourself, but the chariot would surely be crushed."
"We must leave the chariot," said the Scarecrow, "but you two girls can ride upon the backs of the lion and the tiger."
So this was decided upon, and Ozma, as soon as the lion was unfastened from the chariot, at once mounted the beast's back and said she was ready. "Cling fast to his mane," advised Dorothy. "I used to ride him myself, and that's the way I held on." So Ozma clung fast to the mane, and the lion crouched in the path and eyed the swinging mallet carefully until he knew just the instant it would begin to rise in the air. Then, before anyone thought he was ready, he made a sudden leap straight between the Iron Giant's legs, and before the mallet struck the ground again, the lion and Ozma were safe on the other side. The tiger went next. Dorothy sat upon his back and locked her arms around his striped neck, for he had no mane to cling to. He made the leap straight and true as an arrow from a bow, and ere Dorothy realized it, she was out of danger and standing by Ozma's side. Now came the Scarecrow on the sawhorse, and while they made the dash in safety, they were within a hair's breadth of being caught by the descending hammer. Tick-Tock walked up to the very edge of the spot the hammer struck, and as it was raised for the next blow, he calmly stepped forward and escaped its descent. That was an idea for the Tin Woodman to follow, and he also crossed in safety while the great hammer was in the air. But when it came to the 26 officers and the private, their knees were so weak that they could not walk a step.
"In battle we are wonderfully courageous," said one of the generals, "and our foes find us very terrible to face. But war is one thing, and this is another. When it comes to being pounded upon the head by an iron hammer and smashed into pancakes, we naturally object."
"Make a run for it,"
urged the Scarecrow.
"Our knees shake so that we cannot run," answered a captain. "If we should try it, we would all certainly be pounded to a jelly."
"Well, well," sighed the Cowardly Lion.
"I see, friend Tiger. that we must place ourselves in great danger to rescue this bold army. Come with me, and we will do the best we can."
So, Ozma and Dorothy having already dismounted from their backs, the lion and the tiger leapt back again under the awful hammer, and returned with 2 generals clinging to their necks. They repeated this daring passage 12 times, when all the officers had been carried beneath the giant's legs and landed safely on the further side. By that time the beasts were very tired, and panted so hard that their tongues hung out of their great mouths. "But what is to become of the private?" asked Ozma.
"Oh, leave him there to guard the chariot," said the lion. "I'm tired out and won't pass under that mallet again."
The officers at once protested that they must have the private with them, else there would be no one for them to command. But neither the lion nor the tiger would go after him, and so the Scarecrow sent the sawhorse. Either the wooden horse was careless, or it failed to properly time the descent of the hammer, for the mighty weapon caught it squarely upon its head, and thumped it against the ground so powerfully that the private flew off its back high into the air, and landed upon one of the giant's cast-iron arms. Here he clung desperately, while the arm rose and fell with each one of the rapid strokes. The Scarecrow dashed in to rescue his sawhorse, and had his left foot smashed by the hammer before he could pull the creature out of danger. Then they found that the sawhorse had been badly dazed by the blow, for while the hard wooden knot of which his head was formed could not be crushed by the hammer, both his ears were broken off, and he would be unable to hear a sound until some new ones were made for him. Also, his left knee was cracked, and had to be bound up with a string. Billina having fluttered under the hammer, it now remained only to rescue the private who was riding upon the iron giant's arm, high in the air. The Scarecrow lay flat upon the ground and called to the man to jump down upon his body, which was soft because it was stuffed with straw. This the private managed to do, waiting until a time when he was nearest the ground and then letting himself drop upon the Scarecrow. He accomplished the feat without breaking any bones, and the Scarecrow declared he was not injured in the least. Therefore, the Tin Woodman having by this time fitted new ears to the sawhorse, the entire party proceeded upon its way, leaving the giant to pound the path behind them. Hi, this is just a really quick reminder that if you're enjoying the stories on Willow Audiobooks, it would mean the absolute world to me if you'd consider becoming a patron on Patreon. There are 3 different pledge tiers, all with different perks attached to them, and above all, you'd be helping me to make sure I can keep doing this consistently. So please head on over to patreon.com/Willow Audiobooks and check out how you can get involved. Alternatively, I also really appreciate ratings and reviews left on iTunes or wherever you happen to get your podcasts. So if you haven't done that, please do. Thank you so much. Chapter 11. The Gnome King. By and by, when they drew near to the mountain that blocked their path, and which was the furthermost edge of the kingdom of Ev, the way grew dark and gloomy for the reason that the high peaks on either side shut out the sunshine. And it was very silent too, as there were no birds to sing or squirrels to chatter, the trees being left far behind them, and only the bare rocks remaining. Ozma and Dorothy were a little awed by the silence, and all the others were quiet and grave, except the sawhorse, which, as it trotted along with the Scarecrow upon his back, hummed a queer song, of which this was the chorus.
Would a wooden horse in a woodland go? I sigh, he would, although had he not a wooden head, he'd mount the mountain top instead.
But no one paid any attention to this, because they were now close to the Gnome King's dominions, and his splendid underground palace could not be very far away. Suddenly, they heard a shout of jeering laughter, and stopped short. They would have to stop in a minute anyway, for the huge mountain barred their further progress, and the path ran close up to a wall of rock, and ended. "Who was that laughing?" asked Ozma. There was no reply, but in the gloom, they could see strange forms flit across the face of the rock. Whatever the creations might be, they seemed very like the rock itself, for they were the colour of rocks, and their shapes were as rough and rugged as if they had been broken away from the side of the mountain. They kept close to the steep cliff facing our friends, and glided up and down and this way and that, with a lack of regularity that was quite confusing, and they seemed not to need places to rest their feet, but clung to the surface of the rock as a fly does to a window pane, and were never still for a moment.
"Do not mind them,"
said Tick-Tock, as Dorothy shrank back.
"They are only the gnomes."
"And what are gnomes?" asked the girl, half frightened.
"They are rock fairies, and serve the Gnome King,"
replied the machine.
"but they will do us no harm. You must call for the king, because without him you can never find the entrance to the palace."
"You call," said Dorothy to Ozma. Just then the gnomes laughed again, and the sound was so weird and disheartening that the 26 officers commanded the private to right about face, and they all started to run as fast as they could. The Tin Woodman at once pursued his army and cried, "Halt!" And when they had stopped their flight, he asked, "Where are you going?" I find I've forgotten the brush for my whiskers," said a general, trembling with fear.
So we are going back for it."
"That is impossible," replied the Tin Woodman, "for the giant with the hammer would kill you all if you tried to pass him."
"Oh, I'd forgotten the giant,"
said the general, turning pale. "You seem to forget a good many things," remarked the Tin Woodman. "I hope you won't forget that you are brave men."
"Never!"
cried the general, slapping his gold-embroidered chest.
"Never!"
cried all the other officers, indignantly slapping their chests. "For my part," said the private meekly, "I must obey my officers, so that when I'm told to run, I run, and when I'm told to fight, I fight." "That is right," agreed the Tin Woodman. "And now you must all come back to Ozma and obey her orders. And if you try to run away again, I will have her reduce all the 26 officers to privates, and make the private your general." This terrible threat so frightened them that they at once returned to where Ozma was standing beside the Cowardly Lion. Then Ozma cried out in a loud voice, "I demand that the Gnome King appear to us." There was no reply, except that the shifting gnomes upon the mountain laughed in derision.
"You must not command the Gnome King,"
said Tick-Tock.
"for you do not rule him as you do your own people."
So Ozma called again, saying, "I request the Gnome King to appear to us." Only the mocking laughter replied to her, and the shadowy gnomes continued to flit here and there upon the rocky cliff.
"Try entreaty,"
said Tick-Tock to Ozma.
"If he will not come at your request, then the Gnome King may listen to your pleading."
Ozma looked around her proudly. "Do you wish your ruler to plead with this wicked Gnome King?" she asked. "Shall Ozma of Oz humble herself to a creature who lives in an underground kingdom?"
"No!"
they all shouted with big voices, and the Scarecrow added,
"If he will not come, we will dig him out of his hole like a fox and conquer his stubbornness. But our sweet little ruler must always maintain her dignity, just as I maintain mine."
"I'm not afraid to plead with him," said Dorothy. "I'm only a little girl from Kansas, and we've got more dignity at home than we know what to do with. I'll call the Gnome King."
"Do," said the Hungry Tiger, "and if he makes hash of you, I'll willingly eat you for breakfast tomorrow morning."
So Dorothy stepped forward and said, "Please, Mr. Gnome King, come here and see us." The gnomes started to laugh again, but a low growl came from the mountain, and in a flash they had all vanished from sight and were silent. Then a door in the rock opened, and a voice cried,
"Enter!"
Isn't it a trick?
asked the Tin Woodman. Never mind, replied Ozma. We came here to rescue the poor Queen of Ev and her 10 children, and we must run some risks to do so.
The Gnome King is honest and good-natured,
said Tick-Tock.
You can trust him to do what is right.
So, Ozma led the way, hand in hand with Dorothy, and they passed through the arched doorway of rock and entered a long passage which was lighted by jewels set in the walls and having lamps behind them. There was no one to escort them or to show them the way, but all the party pressed through the passage until they came to a round, domed cavern that was grandly furnished. In the centre of this room was a throne carved out of a solid boulder of rock, rude and rugged in shape, but glittering with great rubies and diamonds and emeralds on every part of its surface. And upon the throne sat the Nome King. This important monarch of the underground world was a little fat man clothed in grey-brown garments that were the exact colour of the rock throne in which he was seated. His bushy hair and flowing beard were also coloured like the rocks, and so was his face. He wore no crown of any sort, and his only ornament was a broad, jewel-studded belt that encircled his fat little body. As for his features, they seemed kindly and good-humoured, and his eyes were turned merrily upon his visitors as Ozma and Dorothy stood before him, with their followers ranged in close order behind them.
Why, he looks just like Santa Claus, only he isn't the same colour,
whispered Dorothy to her friend, but the Gnome King heard the speech, and it made him laugh aloud.
He had a red face and a round little belly that shook when he laughed, like a bowl full of jelly,
quoth the monarch in a pleasant voice, and they could all see that he really did shake like jelly when he laughed. Both Ozma and Dorothy were much relieved to find the Gnome King so jolly, and a minute later he waved his right hand, and the girls each found a cushioned stool at her side.
"Sit down, my dears,"
said the king,
"and tell me why you have come all this way to see me, and what I can do to make you happy."
While they seated themselves, the Gnome King picked up a pipe, and taking a glowing red coal out of his pocket, he placed it in the bowl of the pipe and began puffing out clouds of smoke that circled in rings above his head. Dorothy thought this made the little monarch look more like Santa Claus than ever. But Ozma now began speaking, and everyone listened intently to her words. "Your Majesty," said she, "I am the ruler of the land of Oz, and I have come here to ask you to release the good Queen of Ev and her 10 children, whom you have enchanted and hold as your prisoners."
"Oh no, you are mistaken about that,"
replied the king.
"They are not my prisoners, but my slaves, whom I purchased from the King of Ev."
"But that was wrong," said Ozma.
"According to the laws of Ev, the king can do no wrong,"
answered the monarch, eyeing a ring of smoke he had just blown from his mouth.
"so that he had a perfect right to sell his family to me in exchange for a long life."
You cheated him, though, declared Dorothy, for the King of Ev did not have a long life. He jumped into the sea and was drowned.
"That was not my fault,"
said the Gnome King, crossing his legs and smiling contentedly.
"I gave him the long life, all right, but he destroyed it."
Then how could it be a long life?
asked Dorothy.
"Easily enough,"
was the reply.
"Now, suppose, my dear, that I gave you a pretty doll in exchange for a lock of your hair, and that after you had received the doll, you smashed it into pieces and destroyed it. Could you say that I had not given you a pretty doll?"
"No," answered Dorothy.
"And could you, in fairness, ask me to return to you the lock of hair just because you had smashed the doll?
No, said Dorothy again.
Of course not.
The Gnome King turned.
Nor will I give up the Queen and her children, because the King of Ev destroyed his long life by jumping into the sea. They belong to me, and I shall keep them.
But you are treating them cruelly, said Ozma, who was much distressed by the king's refusal.
In what way?
He asked. By making them your slaves, said she.
Cruelty,
remarked the monarch, puffing out wreaths of smoke and watching them float into the air,
is a thing I can't abide. So, as slaves must work hard, and the Queen of Ev and her children were delicate and tender, I transformed them all into articles of ornament and bric-a-brac, and scattered them around the various rooms of my palace. Instead of being obliged to labour, they merely decorate my apartments, and I really think I have treated them with great kindness.
But what a dreadful fate is theirs, exclaimed Ozma earnestly, and the kingdom of Ev is in great need of its royal family to govern it. If you will liberate them and restore them to their proper forms, I will give you 10 ornaments to replace each one you lose. The Gnome King looked grave.
Suppose I refuse?
He asked. Then, said Ozma firmly, I am here with my friends and my army to conquer your kingdom and oblige you to obey my wishes. The Gnome King laughed until he choked, and he choked until he coughed, and he coughed until his face turned from greyish-brown to bright red. And then he wiped his eyes with a rock-coloured handkerchief and grew grave again.
You are as brave as you are pretty, my dear,
he said to Ozma.
But you have little idea of the extent of the task you have undertaken. Come with me for a moment.
He arose and took Ozma's hand, leading her to a little door at one side of the room. This he opened, and they stepped out upon a balcony, from whence they obtained a wonderful view of the underground world. A vast cave extended for miles and miles under the mountain, and in every direction were furnaces and forges glowing brightly, and gnomes hammering upon precious metals or polishing gleaming jewels. All around the walls of the cave were thousands of doors of silver and gold built into the solid rock, and these extended in rows far away into the distance, as far as Ozma's eyes could follow them. While the little maid from Oz gazed wonderingly upon this scene, the Gnome King uttered a shrill whistle, and at once all the silver and gold doors flew open, and solid ranks of gnome soldiers marched out from every one. So great were their numbers that they quickly filled the immense underground cavern and forced the busy workmen to abandon their tasks. Although this tremendous army consisted of rock-coloured gnomes, all squat and fat, they were clothed in glittering armour of polished steel, inlaid with beautiful gems. Upon his brow, each wore a brilliant electric light, and they bore sharp spears and swords and battle-axes of solid bronze. It was evident that they were perfectly trained, for they stood in straight rows, rank after rank, with their weapons held erect and true, as if awaiting but the word of command to level them upon their foes.
This,
said the Gnome King,
is but a small part of my army. No ruler upon Earth has ever dared to fight me, and no ruler ever will, for I am too powerful to oppose.
He whistled again, and at once the martial array filed through the silver and gold doorways and disappeared, after which the workmen again resumed their labours at the furnaces. Then, sad and discouraged, Ozma of Oz turned to her friends, and the Gnome King calmly reseated himself on his rock throne. It would be foolish for us to fight, the girl said to the Tin Woodman, for our brave 27 would be quickly destroyed. I'm sure I do not know how to act in this emergency.
Ask the king where his kitchen is, suggested the tiger. I am hungry as a bear. I might pounce upon the king and tear him in pieces, remarked the cowardly lion.
Try it,
said the monarch, lighting his pipe with another hot coal which he took from his pocket. The lion crouched low and tried to spring upon the Gnome King, but he hopped only a little way into the air and came down again in the same place, not being able to approach the throne by even an inch.
It seems to me,
said the Scarecrow thoughtfully,
that our best plan is to wheedle His Majesty into giving up his slaves, since he is too great a magician to oppose.
That is the most sensible thing any of you have suggested,
declared the Gnome King.
It is folly to threaten me, but I am so kind-hearted that I cannot stand coaxing or wheedling. If you really wish to accomplish anything by your journey, my dear Ozma, you must coax me.
Very well, said Ozma more cheerfully. Let us be friends and talk this over in a friendly manner.
To be sure,
agreed the king, his eyes twinkling merrily. I am very anxious, she continued, to liberate the Queen of Ev and her children, who are now ornaments and bric-a-brac in your Majesty's palace, and to restore them to their people. Tell me, sir, how this may be accomplished. The king remained thoughtful for a moment, after which he asked,
Are you willing to take a few chances and risks yourself in order to set free the people of Ev?
Yes, indeed, answered Ozma eagerly.
Then,
said the Gnome King,
I will make you this offer. You shall go alone and unattended into my palace and examine carefully all that the rooms contain. Then you shall have permission to touch 11 different objects, pronouncing at the time the word Ev. And if any one of them, or more than one, proves to be the transformation of the Queen of Ev or any of her 10 children, then they will instantly be restored to their true forms, and may leave my palace and my kingdom in your company, without any objection whatever. It is possible for you, in this way, to free the entire 11. But, if you do not guess all the objects correctly, and some of the slaves remain transformed, then each one of your friends and followers may in turn enter the palace, and have the same privileges I grant you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for this kind offer, said Ozma eagerly.
I make but one condition,
added the Gnome King, his eyes twinkling. What is it? She inquired.
If none of the 11 objects you touch proves to be the transformation of any of the royal family of Ev, then, instead of freeing them, you will yourself become enchanted and transformed into an article of bric-a-brac or an ornament. This is only fair and just, and is the risk you declared you were willing to take.
Chapter 12. The 11 Guesses. Hearing this condition imposed by the Gnome King, Ozma became silent and thoughtful, and all her friends looked at her uneasily. Don't you do it, exclaimed Dorothy. If you guess wrong, you will be enslaved yourself. But I shall have 11 guesses, answered Ozma. Surely I ought to guess one object in 11 correctly. And if I do, I shall rescue one of the royal family and be safe myself. Then the rest of you may attempt it, and soon we shall free all those who are enslaved.
What if we fail?
inquired the Scarecrow.
I'd look nice as a piece of bric-a-brac, wouldn't I?
We must not fail, cried Ozma courageously. Having come all this distance to free these poor people, it would be weak and cowardly in us to abandon the adventure. Therefore, I will accept the Gnome King's offer, and go at once into the royal palace.
Come along then, my dear,
said the king, climbing down from his throne with some difficulty because he was so fat.
I'll show you the way.
He approached a wall of the cave and waved his hand. Instantly, an opening appeared, through which Ozma, after a smiling farewell to her friends, boldly passed. She found herself in a splendid hall that was more beautiful and grand than anything she had ever beheld. The ceilings were composed of great arches that rose far above her head, and all the walls and floors were of polished marble, exquisitely tinted in many colours. Thick velvet carpets were on the floor, and heavy silken draperies covered the arches leading to the various rooms of the palace. The furniture was made of rare old woods, richly carved and covered with delicate satins, and the entire palace was lighted by a mysterious rosy glow that seemed to come from no particular place, but flooded each apartment with its soft and pleasing radiance. Ozma passed from one room to another, greatly delighted by all she saw. The lovely palace had no other occupant, for the Gnome King had left her at the entrance, which closed behind her, and in all the magnificent rooms there appeared to be no other person. Upon the mantels, and on many shelves and brackets and tables, were clustered ornaments of every description, seemingly made out of all sorts of metals, glass, china, stones, and marbles. There were vases, and figures of men and animals, and graven platters and bowls, and mosaics of precious gems, and many other things. Pictures, too, were on the walls, and the underground palace was quite a museum of rare and curious and costly objects. After her first hasty examination of the rooms, Ozma began to wonder which of all the numerous ornaments they contained were the transformations of the royal family of Ev. There was nothing to guide her, for everything seemed without a spark of life, so she must guess blindly. And for the first time, the girl came to realize how dangerous was her task, and how likely she was to lose her own freedom in striving to free others from the bondage of the Gnome King. No wonder the cunning monarch had laughed good-naturedly with his visitors, when he knew how easily they might be entrapped. But Ozma, having undertaken the venture, would not abandon it. She looked at a silver candelabra that had 10 branches, and thought, "This may be the Queen of Ev and her 10 children." So she touched it, and uttered aloud the word, "Ev," as the Gnome King had instructed her to do when she guessed. But the candelabra remained as it was before. Then she wandered into another room, and touched a china lamb, thinking it might be one of the children she sought. But again she was unsuccessful. 3 guesses, 4 guesses, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 she made, and still not one of them was right. The girl shivered a little, and grew pale even under the rosy light, for now but one guess remained, and her own fate depended on the result. She resolved not to be hasty, and strolled through all the rooms once more, gazing earnestly upon the various ornaments, and trying to decide which she would touch. Finally, in despair, she decided to leave it entirely to chance. She faced the doorway of a room, shut her eyes tightly, and then, thrusting aside the heavy draperies, she advanced blindly with her right arm outstretched before her. Slowly, softly, she crept forward until her hand came in contact with an object upon a small round table. She did not know what it was, but in a low voice she pronounced the word, "Ev." The rooms were quite empty of life after that. the Gnome King had gained a new ornament. For upon the edge of the table rested a pretty grasshopper that seemed to have been formed from a single emerald. It was all that remained of Ozma of Oz. In the throne room just beyond the palace, the Gnome King suddenly looked up and smiled.
Next,
he said in his pleasant voice. Dorothy, the Scarecrow, and the Tin Woodman, who had been sitting in anxious silence, each gave a start of dismay and stared into one another's eyes.
Has she failed?
Asked Tick-Tock.
so it seems.
Answered the little monarch cheerfully.
But that is no reason one of you should not succeed. The next may have 12 guesses instead of 11, for there are now 12 persons transformed into ornaments. Well, well, which of you goes next?
I'll go, said Dorothy. Not so, replied the Tin Woodman. As commander of Ozma's army, it is my privilege to follow her and attempt her rescue. Away you go then, said the Scarecrow. But be careful, old friend. I will, promised the Tin Woodman. And then he followed the Gnome King to the entrance to the palace, and the rock closed behind him. To stay updated with Willow Audiobooks, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Willow Audiobooks on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. Or you can visit our webpage at stephenalexanderwillis.com/Willow Audiobooks. If you're enjoying this audiobook, why not leave a rating or a review on iTunes or wherever you happen to get your podcasts?